I tried to keep it around 20 minutes, which means I cut a lot of detail. And so feel free to prompt me in the Q&A to come back and add more details back in. So first, a huge thanks to Julie and her team for putting months, probably more time into planning these events this week. It's a very stunning lineup of events. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all at some of the other things this week. I also want to thank Denise for the introduction. And thanks to you, the audience, for taking time to be here. It's definitely an honor to get to speak alongside my colleagues this week, including my immediate colleague in English. I want to hype them. Dr. Jess Goldberg is going to be speaking tomorrow at 3 p.m. So check that talk out if you can. Today's talk examines the question, what do Jamaican plantation logbooks have to do with Methodist spiritual journals? And I'm going to give you some answers right away. First, they arguably both share 16th century origin, a 16th century origin point in shopkeepers' logs. And some scholars trace it back even further to maybe 12th century logs that were kept aboard ships. So like Ramses VII, his fleet kept on board logs on their ships. Second, these two genres share an impulse to prove efficient use of time and efficient use of labor, but in pointedly different ways, which you'll see a little bit later in the talk. Before I say more about journals and logbooks, I want to give some introductory remarks explaining how I arrived at this question in my research. From there, I'll give short histories of spiritual journal writing, Methodist journals, early 19th century manuals that advise how best to keep plantation records, followed by a final section on a Jamaican logbook from 1825 to 1828. That's a lot to try to cover in 20 minutes. So again, prompt me in the Q&A if you want me to come back in more detail to any part of these remarks. In my research, I specialize in British literature from the late 1600s to the early 1800s, and I work on the colonial Caribbean. My research has been archival based for about the past 10 years. I apply analytical tools of literary analysis to texts that may not immediately seem literary, such as legislative records, letters from military folks, advertisements for runaway slaves, gravestones, and for the current project, spiritual journals and logbooks. And I take this approach to counteract the gaps in the mainstream literature of the time period that I study. My interest in comparing plantation logbooks and spiritual journals, which might seem kind of weird on the surface, originated during my time teaching at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, from 2020 to 2022. The entire campus had been asked to incorporate more indigenous theories of education into our teaching and research. And one such idea is place-based knowing. Remember, I specialize in British literature and Caribbean literature from about 200 years ago. Nevertheless, I decided to seriously consider what it would look like to do place-based research in Durango in 2020, 2021, 2022, and so forth. The answer came to me in the form of that institution's history as a so-called Indian boarding school. Boarding school leaders had kept detailed logs and journals about the students in residence, including the students who had run away or refused to work. And runaway slaves in the British Caribbean had been a major focus of my research up to that point, and so I started to see some connections. I also made the connection between record keeping from Fort Lewis's boarding school days to the British plantation logbooks, which I had been examining at that point in archives from Liverpool to Kingston. As I began studying the boarding school logs, I also learned about the influence of spiritual journals in keeping track of the hours and days and weeks and months and the daily habits and practices, spiritual practices in addition to labor practices. This is when it occurred to me to consider spiritual journals and plantation logbooks side by side. So it was important to me to kind of give you that background of my previous institution and how I came to this question. I'm no longer at Fort Lewis, of course, but I'm still interested in comparing the seemingly disparate genres of 18th century spiritual journals and Caribbean plantation logbooks in order to foreground the intertwined issues of tracking labor, valuing that labor in terms of time. And here's the important part for me that's still kind of an unanswered question that you'll see later in the talk. The consequences of falling short of perceived efficiency in these data sets. So now as I move into a short history of spiritual journal writing and Methodist journaling, I want to note that spiritual journals are much more widely studied than logbooks. And even then, it's been just a few decades that that journals have been this legitimate, at least in literary studies, that journals have been this legitimate body of research for our colleagues. So again, spiritual journals are much more widely studied than logbooks, and yet the largest collection of accounts produced in English in the 18th century that track both time and labor were plantation logbooks. However, logbooks on their surface do not seem to tell like a human, quote unquote, human story, such as what a journal might reveal. They're just pages and pages of numbers, right? But from the vantage of my research interests, which again compel me to consider the gaps in mainstream literature of the period, logbooks are also one of the largest collections of accounts of enslaved people's lives, which have been underrepresented in the texts of the time period. Make sure you can see this whole slide. This is a bit of a timeline. It's incomplete, but it's kind of a watered down version of a potential timeline. Scholars such as Tom Webster have pointed out that keeping business accounts predates the rise of personal spiritual journals and possibly even those shipboard accounts that I talked about dating back to the 12th the 12th century. But business accounts predate spiritual journals, which were likely modeled on shopkeepers' accounts. The popular rise in spiritual journals in English can be traced to 17th century Anglicans, but there's evidence of even earlier origins. At least one scholar points to the influence of so-called ego literature in the Elizabethan period, but I don't see a lot of people like really supporting this, so it might just be one person's idea. There's also an association with experimental Calvinism. You can see on the slide that Calvinists talked of God having an account book, such as recording our thoughts, words, and deeds. Furthermore, Protestant devotional manuals were produced and read at least by the 1580s. So these were manuals, if not explicitly teaching the reader how to keep a journal, how to structure their lives in terms of a life spent in devotion and pursuit of righteousness. Now, fast forward, if I can say that word, to 1603. This is a text called Seven Treatises by Richard Rogers, and I have a quote on the next slide here. Rogers was among the first known printed texts to note the analogy between shopkeepers' accounts and spiritual journals. So whereas scholars are thinking about this timeline going from ship's logs to shopkeepers' accounts, Richard Rogers in 1630 is someone who explicitly made that analogy clear in his work. So Roger explains in this book that men who are in great occupying, so important people, write down their takings and their layings out and even spend time reviewing their accounts, lest, and this is a quote from Rogers, lest any delay of time should cause forgetfulness. So writing it down is this technology of remembering. If in all this effort, Roger says, is expended for, quote, things that perish, then, quote, how much more necessary in the accounts of our souls that we should do the same, that is, daily look at what we gain or lose, that we may procure to ourselves thereby most sound safety and provide better for the time to come, unquote. Now, rather than counting goods or payment, spiritual self-accounts track time spent laboring towards spiritual goals. These journals were even sometimes meant for a wider audience, if intended by that writer or even by their family for publication. Now, moving on to the Methodists. Well, spiritual journal writing in Britain clearly is not the sole literary property of Methodists. From the beginning, journal writing was an important aspect of many Methodists' private faith practice, including several of its founders. Methodism arose in the 1730s in England and is part of a long tradition of Protestant dissenters from the Church of England. Methodism also has ties back to Calvinism, which you saw on the previous slide, as well as evangelicalism, which is arising in England around the same time, so 1730s, late 1730s. While undergraduates at Oxford University, brothers John and Charles Wesley formed a Bible study group that was mocked for being methodological. Later on, the term Methodism stuck. So if you ever wondered why that denomination got called that, it was initially undergraduates being mean to their fellows and mocking them for their Bible study. And here is, I'm going to skip a lot that's on this slide. If you want me to say more about Selina Hastings or George Whitefield, I certainly can in the Q&A if those names strike a resonance to you, or if you just want to know more. Here's an image of the shorthand journal, and shorthand is kind of like a code or like an abbreviated way of keeping an account. And I apologize, it looks a little blurry. It didn't quite look that blurry earlier, but here you go. This is a shorthand journal John Wesley kept in Georgia Colony. John's the older brother, but he joined the Bible study later, so Charles actually founded it. But anyway, George kept this journal during his failed, or excuse me, John kept this journal during his failed missionary efforts in the 1730s in Georgia Colony. And one of the journaling methods followed and promoted by both Wesleys involved keeping an inventory of how the hours in a day were spent. So such as prayer, Bible study, visiting people in prisons, providing for those in poverty. And actually for anyone in the audience who has sat through time management or productivity workshops, you might have been instructed in a similar format, but without the religious angle. The basic idea in these workshops is to write down all of your activities during a certain period, usually a week, to become more self-aware of how you spend your time. Armed with the resulting self-awareness, you can then make, or at least the idea goes, you can make strategic interventions and improvements in the areas of inefficient or wasted, quote unquote, wasted time. I kind of hate this, right? Because it makes us feel like our leisure time or our downtime is not productive. And if that has ever annoyed you, you can potentially thank the Methodists or the evangelicals for those attitudes. If you need a scapegoat, that is. So for the early Methodists, tracking daily activities over time was intended to help improve time management, specifically to allow the individual to make more room for spiritual pursuits. And now, almost 300 years later, Methodists continue to advocate for journaling and tracking time. The UK, United Kingdom-based website for the Methodist Church, this is the top left one with the red headings, they have a full page dedicated to the topic of journaling, which, according to the page, quote, can give clarity about the experiences of our days and weeks. It can help us notice God at work, end quote. And on this page, prospective journal keepers are presented with 4 effective ways to journal, including bullet journals, sketch notes, Bible journaling, and what the site calls extended writing. Personally, I think the Wesleys would have been completely obsessed with bullet journaling. Now, the US-based website for the United Methodist Church, and these are the ones in kind of the blue tone, they also encourage spiritual journaling. Visitors to that site are invited to, quote, rethink church through a structured 7-day journaling activity that prompts entries on pre-selected topics. The United Methodist page anticipates that participants, quote, will have ample opportunity to pause and begin to see the presence of God's grace in their everyday lives, end quote. So 300 years or so after the founding of this movement, we're actually seeing less of a focus on noticing the journal keeper's own labor. And I think that's kind of a defining difference from the earlier to now the contemporary advice on journaling. The older journals had very much so more of an emphasis on the writer's own labor. So tracking your labor, tracking the individual's effort to get closer to God. However, the target audience for these spiritual journals is still the journal keeper themselves. You're writing it for yourself, for self-awareness, self-assessment. In contrast with the advice for keeping spiritual journals, and I'm thinking specifically 18th century advice like that the Wesleys would have provided, the published advice on keeping effective plantation logbooks in the British Caribbean colonies points to the proprietor as the target audience and the bookkeeper or the overseer as the author. One plantation logbook manual I consulted goes so far as to assume that logbooks were written for absentee proprietors who no longer lived on the estate or even on the same island and perhaps had never lived anywhere in the Caribbean. And so again, it's that written technology, the writing, the text aids as a memory device, but also the account given to somebody who has never even seen or experienced the events being accounted for, or the labor, I want to say, being accounted for. So this is one of the newer areas of investigation for the project. That is to say, like looking at the manuals that would have been printed for the bookkeepers, for the accountants, for the enslavers, and how they're keeping track of the labor of enslaved people. The variations I've seen in the logbooks themselves so not the manuals, but the actual logbooks. This suggests to me that logbooks were not commercially available blank books. Rather, they were DIY'd for much, if not all, of the British colonial period. And actually, a similar history applies to journals. So commercially produced journals that you could go to a bookstore and buy, something that was meant to be someone's private journal, these commercially produced journals were not widely available in Britain until the 19th century. I did come across one commercially produced logbook from the middle of the 19th century, but from the United States. On this slide in front of you right now, you can see a broadside. A broadside is just a one-page advertisement, and this is for the Plantation Record and Account Book by Thomas Affleck. His book was published, or his blank kind of template was published on or after January 1847. This is actually well after enslaved people had been emancipated in most of the British colonies. Indentured servitude still continued. So again, this is a different context, but I'm just finding it interesting as part of this conversation. And the advertisement for Affleck's book says that it's a, quote, good-sized blank book of excellent paper, well and substantially bound, each record and account in its proper place, ruled and headed, so arranged as to render the correct keeping, and this is the part that I find the most interesting. This book is arranged so that anyone, whether acquainted with accounts or not, can hopefully successfully use this technology, according to the advertisement. The blank account book included pages for inventorying stock, implements, and tools, pages for lists to record articles given to enslaved people, pages for accounts of daily labor, pages to record births and deaths among the enslaved population, and pages with tables for recording the cotton picked per individual. So another major difference, cotton was not really a crop grown in the British Caribbean, but certainly was in the United States. Accounting technologies, so like this book, the accounting technologies available to us shape what and how data is collected, but also users' own inclinations for logging data influence the technologies that are developed through time. Now, back to the British side of things. In 1823, just a few years before the logbook I'm going to discuss next, Thomas Ruffley's The Jamaican Planter's Guide, or A System for Planting and Managing a Sugar Estate, was published in London. In this book, Ruffley admonishes the plantation attorney to, quote, keep fair and equitable accounts of the various transactions of the estate in as simple a manner as the nature of things will admit of. There should be laid before the proprietor, the enslaver, in plain legible terms, the account of the estate to the end of every year, a list of the slaves and stock with their increase and decrease, the cultivation of the estate with its returns, the names and numbers of the white people resident on the estate with their occupations and salaries, and the list of clothing and salt provisions served to the slaves, among a few other things, but those are kind of the highlights. The thing that is most astonishing to me about this advice is that in the dozens of logbooks from the British Caribbean that I have examined, I don't recall seeing any accounts of the white residents of any estates in any logbook. However, the simple manner of recording and tables showing increases and decreases in stock, that was utterly pervasive across every logbook I have examined, spanning about 50 years. So again, thinking about these manuals as artifacts that don't necessarily prove how the logbooks were kept, but maybe this like idealized vision of how to manage labor and time, and for the purpose of showing efficient use of both. Now, the logbook I will discuss in the remainder of this talk is housed at the National Library of Jamaica. So thanks to those archivists for all of their assistance every time I go visit. I visited this archive most recently in June 2023 with support, with financial support from New Mexico Highlands University. And I don't have any photographs to share, but the background image from this slide, which I'll leave up for the next few minutes, I took this photo of an image, I think it's an engraving of Trial Estate, and the original is housed at an archive at Yale University. All right, so the Montpelier Estate logbook for 1825 to 1828 is a little larger than a laptop. It's about twice as thick. So the kind of two dimensions are about the size of a laptop, and if you think of the how thick that book is, it's about two laptops stacked on top of each other. It seems that the pages were originally blank, but tables and charts have been inked, excuse me, onto almost every page, ranging in number of rows and columns based on the specific data being collected. So these tables were inked onto blank pages for the specific accounting needs of that table. There are very few, actually pretty much none, narrative or descriptive passages. Some of the tables are aligned with the top of the page. So what I'm thinking of vertically, if you have the book open, and some of the tables are aligned with the gutter, that's the inside margin, if you flip the book and have thinking of the book being horizontal. And even the recurring tables, such as increases and decreases of the population from year to year, they change in orientation seemingly based on the whim of the bookkeeper. So this is not a template that was commercially produced. So I also want to note, in terms of describing this physical object, lines appear in different colored ink and perhaps even pencil on occasion. It's hard to tell sometimes with a 200-year-old text and the decay of that physical object. At least the way the color appears today, the ink color ranges from bluish or grayish to brownish. Most of the lines of the tables are drawn in that bluish or grayish ink, and then all of the words and figures in the logbook and some of the lines are drawn in that more brownish ink. If the current binding is original, and I do suspect it is, it has deteriorated quite badly, and it gives off thick orange dust on those white cotton archival gloves, if you're familiar with what those gloves look like. There are many noteworthy things about the content of the Montpelier logbook, including how it recorded reproductive labor. That was the focus of the last talk I gave on this work in progress, and I'm happy to say more in the Q&A if folks are interested. But where agricultural or skilled labor is recorded, the accounts simultaneously remark age, gender, and disability or illness next to that type of labor, implying that there were requisite conditions of age and health, if not also gender, for certain categories of labor. So I'll give one quick example. The oldest males recorded in these labor logs, they often had at least one debility, and that's the language of the logbook. So we're not seeing the word disability, we're seeing the word debility. These individuals were assigned duties of watching over fields and perimeters. So while their bodies could no longer support agricultural or skilled labor, exposure to the elements would not have been conducive to healing from ailments or debilities either. And I see a cruel double logic here of efficiency and disposability in these labor assignments. The elderly enslaved person is compelled to labor in a way that their body can technically sustain in the short term, but also this labor will eventually still kill them, which is kind of the entire logic of the plantation system. Montpelier Estate was among the largest Jamaican plantations of its time, with about 400 enslaved people throughout the years available in the log. In 1825, the logbook numbers 199 enslaved males and 212 enslaved females, totaling 411. The logbook records 7 babies delivered in 1825 with the birthing parents named, and they're seemingly credited in the accounts for their reproductive labor, which again was the focus of the last talk I gave on this work in progress. And because the names are available, I feel like it's important to share them with you. So these 7 individuals participated in, I don't know if participated the word I want to use, but these 7 individuals are recorded in this book as completing reproductive labor in the year 1825. Jane Lawrence, Ann Dodd, Jane Richards, Sally Gray, Ann Miller, Elizabeth Rose, and Sarah Richards. Now this, again, participates in that pervasive logic of logbooks to record the increases and decreases of population, in addition to the actual labor performed. If the Montpelier population increased through births, it decreased through both death and manumission, and also running away. Death often occurred from debility, that word I used a couple minutes ago, and debility often occurred from labor. In 1827, there were 4 individuals ranging in age from 39 to 73 who had been noted as invalid or debilitated. and were recorded as having died from their debility that year. 2 others had not been classified as invalid or debilitated in 1827, died from a scald, which was most likely a labor-related injury, and dropsy, and those individuals were 43 and 50, respectively. Additionally, Sarah Miller, age 17, died of convulsions. Anne Headley's baby, unnamed in the log but noted as, quote, weakly from its birth, died at 2 weeks of age, and a 10-month-old named Catherine Goodwin died of, quote, spasms. This is all 1827. Ellen Warren, age 31, was freed by her father in 1827, so she's included in the decreases. The expense of her manumission was 120 pounds. The monetary value of enslaved people at Montpelier at this time period ranged from 20 pounds to 150. So Ellen Warren's manumission cost was at the high end of valuation. Other logbooks at similarly sized plantations typically recorded on average 10 runaways for any given year. This logbook didn't really account for that, and I think that might have been a choice of the bookkeeper. In fact, in one logbook, I was able to look at a person was still being recorded in the labor log year after year, nearly a decade after he had initially run away. And so still being counted in those labor logs as a non-contributing factor, but still counted, which I find just endlessly fascinating. In addition to recording the enslaved population and their compulsory labors, the Montpelier logbook includes tables listing the condition of each, quote, family's house. And I'm putting quotes around that because it's unclear from the log what actually constituted a family. Was this forced? Was this a chosen family? How was this arranged? I am inclined to read family here as another unit of organizing labor. So organizing domestic labor in this case and recording its efficiency. The bookkeeper's commentary on these houses ranges from things like very good wattled and plastered walls, comma, shingled, comma, kitchen, to wattled and thatched wants repair. The labor required to maintain such dwellings is not explicitly recorded in the log on an individual or family basis, to the extent like agricultural or skilled labor was recorded. But I take as implied the labor required by 400 enslaved people to house and feed themselves. This domestic labor absolutely subsidized the maintenance expenses of the enslaver, increasing the appearance of the overall efficiency in terms of time, that kind of like time-money nexus of the plantation. So by way of conclusion, since I figured I'm out of time around this point, I want to point out some things that might have become obvious. Compared with some spiritual journals, specifically ones written in long-form sentences and paragraphs as opposed to bullet journals or shorthand, the logbooks almost entirely lack narrative passages, so not just Montpelier, but all logbooks. Perhaps even more importantly, and I think this next point I want to make is probably where the argument for the overall research will grow out of. Logbooks lack the subjective accounts of the people whose labor they record. Logbooks record a collective body of enslaved people where the self-examination that we see in spiritual journals, if I can even call it that, the self-examination of the labor and the efficient use of time, that examination made possible by the log casts the human property as an extension of the enslaver's self. So I'll say that again in case it didn't make sense the first time. The logbooks record a collective body. So the self-examination made possible by the log of labor and efficient use of time casts the human property as an extension of the enslaver's self. And even if this is kind of a hiccup or a problem in the research, I'd like to view this as an opportunity to continue refining my questions and my methods. And so you're getting kind of this sneak peek of research that's currently in progress. So in my ongoing work, I will be looking for ways to account for that difference between self-recording in the case of journals or being the object of accounts made by others with near absolute power over daily movements in the case of logbooks. And in this work as a whole, I see possible implications for historical understanding of labor management, ideas of leisure, as well as extending awareness of enslaved people's resistance to compulsory labor. If taken as a combined data set, the journals and logbooks suggest that their compilers were striving for their own versions of optimal efficiency that had not yet been achieved, nor in some cases had even been clearly defined. So it's like we'll know it when we see it. And in those moments of accounting, the lives recorded in the data still exceeded the attempts to contain and reform them into bare labor. So I will say thank you at that point. And the final slide is a picture of me on one of my first archival research trips to Jamaica. I'm at the National Archives in Spanish Town in this photo, where I was able to see some logbooks actually in Jamaica, as opposed to at some of these other archives wherever else in the world these things are kept. So I think I'll stop sharing, right? And see if we have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Schneider. Does anybody have any questions? And while I wait for that response, I just want to say it's so I don't know, I'm going to say chilling to hear human beings their existence being recorded like, I don't know, jars of molasses or something. You know, it's still pretty that whole idea of they were just possessions, and you know they were tracked, their value increased, their value decreased. So we do have one question here from Mel Soto. Why do you believe that the number of runaway slaves or the narrative of the resistance of slaves is omitted so often?
Thanks, Mel. It's good to see you in the talk. So, and I think the next question is about runaways too. So let me see if I can combine them. Eddie says that you said about 10 runaways were recorded out of any given year. Do you know out of how many? What would the percentage be? Awesome. So I can fold those questions together, and this is a long-standing area of my research interests. And so I'm happy that the conversation, at least initially, has gone in this direction. So the Montpelier estate had about 400, give or take about a dozen, enslaved individuals in the years of the logbook that I discussed today, so 1825 to 1828. This made it one of the largest plantations at the time in Jamaica, and actually across the whole British colonial Caribbean. And about 10 runaways was roughly average for a plantation of that size, at least to be recorded. The study of the phenomenon of self-emancipation or running away includes running away for an afternoon, for a weekend, for a period of a month, maybe longer. So when we talk about this idea of running away from the plantation system, it doesn't always mean forever and ever into the backcountry to join the Maroons, for example, in Jamaica. And so the choice for the keeper of these records to record a runaway person or group of people relies on a lot of things that honestly us today at this vantage may never know. In terms of the logbooks themselves as a technology of accounting for labor and then absent labor, the account book was one of the sources that the plantation used to report for tax purposes. And so the logbook would be looked at every quarter maybe, and those numbers of the numbers of enslaved people, the numbers of cattle, other stock would have been reported to the vestry office, and then those numbers would have been used to then tax that landowner and that enslaver. And a part that I cut from this version of these remarks points out that, so 1828 is the end of the period of the logbook I shared with you today. 1834, so fewer than 10 years later, is when emancipation begins in the British overseas colonies, in most of them, not all of them. That's one of those kind of errors of history. We flatten it out. We say emancipation happened in all of Britain, and it didn't actually. It happened in most places, but not all. Anyway, in 1834, when emancipation occurs, the British taxpayers bail out, like, what does that sound like, right? The British taxpayers bail out the enslavers, and enslavers are credited money for every enslaved person that they accounted for in their possession. So back to where the questions are going here. If somebody has run away 10 years ago and is still being recorded in a logbook, there's this like tax slippage that happens where that person is still counted as property, even though their labor hasn't been exploited in that place for many, many years. So enslavers got paid for people who had absconded, self-emancipated, ran away, whatever you want to say here. They also got paid for people who had been dead, but had still been recorded in a logbook for whatever reason. So the short version, that's kind of a long version, but I think a short version to what these questions are asking is we can approach historical records created by enslavers with suspicion. The accounting technologies used in these documents often had a very specific purpose that was not to record the actual textures of life, of emotion, of feeling, of ambition, of just like a human life, right? These records that are able to be read by historians and literary scholars today were never set out to provide those kind of details that we as readers, as listeners, as audience members might crave today. And that's just kind of lost to history. Let me see if I missed anything with those questions. So again, Mel, the idea of resistance. Resistance has a, like, how do I want to say this? The point of resistance is to not be known, right? So like the point of resistance is for the enslaver not to know the objective, the goal, the end vision for that person or that group of people to resist. And so we often don't, we as in historians, as literary scholars, often don't have access to text or documents that fully lay out all of the details of resistance, because the point was for it to not be known by the people who were creating these records, the enslavers. But yeah, thank you both for those questions. I really appreciate your engagement.
Do we have any other questions, comments?
Has anybody done the thing where you kept track of everything you did for a week or more? Has anyone had that experience? I'm really curious.
Mel says she tried to keep a dream journal. It would be really hard, I think, to keep track of everything I did in even a, okay, say 6 hour period. Can't even imagine. Yeah, Mel says it lasted 3 weeks.
Yeah, I'm curious if people in the audience have been to these same like time management trainings I've been to at various stages of my career, where someone sits you down in a like a hotel like lecture conference room or something, and it's like, okay, here's how you unlock your best maximum efficiency for a week. You keep track of everything you do from waking up to going to bed, and then you assess where's the wasted time, where are the things like the social media doom scrolling that you can cut back on. And you know, like the Methodists felt that way too. In some ways, the plantation logbooks follow that logic as well, like to maximize this like sun up to some sundown and even beyond behaviors and habits. But I just feel like human lives aren't that way, right? Like, I don't know. Anyway, I'm rambling, but I was super curious if anyone in the audience had had that experience and how it made you feel to try to keep track of your life in that way. Denise, I'm going to call on, I see a hand raised. Dr. Goldberg, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. As usual, I'm not on the thread that you've just opened up because I'm still catching up and gathering. But while you were asking about time management, I guess first what I'm really struck with in your research and your presentation that's so important to me as someone who teaches a lot about slavery is the way that you've helped us all on this on this Zoom call, like understand definitionally that chattel slavery is defined by the propertization of people and not by merely enforced labor, right? So the exploitation of labor is not the definition of slavery; it's actually the propertization of people, and that's like something that that's really important for all of us to like really understand that difference. And I really appreciate how clear your attention to the archive makes that for us. I'm wondering about management and time management and this kind of like impulse towards efficiency connecting to the questions by Mel and Eddie about resistance. And I'm wondering what you like if there are moments in the materials that you're looking through, particularly the log books more than the other than the spiritual journals. If there are moments in log books where um, there are notations of inefficiency because as I listen to you talk, one of my thoughts I'm thinking of in an Americanist context, someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes about the ways that enslaved people basically use techniques that we would now call striking
Yeah.
um, to disrupt. So I'm wondering if like there are moments where there is not the internal thoughts of the enslaved, but there are inefficiencies emerging that might index in a way that we can never know for sure could be like these moments of disruption of the enslaver that might be happening. And so I'm wondering, like, do you have examples? Do you have any like juicy tidbits of like, oh yeah, these things happened?
Yeah. Yes. Oh my God. Where to begin with that question? Thank you so much. Again, go listen to their talk tomorrow at 3 p.m., right? Yeah. All right. Don't miss that talk tomorrow. To answer this question, I want to look beyond logbooks. As you heard at the start of the talk, I spend a lot of time looking at archival materials that don't necessarily seem literary. I'm a literary historian, literary scholar, but I use those methods of critical analysis that we have available to us in literary studies. And I actually spent several years obsessing over court, so like legal court records of a trial of a rebellion leader. And this rebellion was called the Baptist War, the Christmas Rebellion. Notice the nexus of Christian faith and resistance to labor, compulsory labor. So the presumed leader of this rebellion was named Sam Sharp. In theory, the textual record doesn't actually know for sure what this individual's name definitively was, which I love. I love, love, love that. And the trial record, so like the actual transcript of this trial, revealed, to the extent that we want to trust that historical record, revealed that this rebellion was intended as a labor strike. So it occurred around the Christmas season, 1831 to spring 1832, and discussions in Parliament back in England were coming across the Atlantic, so in newspapers. The enslaved people, I actually have a published article on this, the enslaved people who were literate in English were able to read, like so the story goes, were able to read reports of Parliament debating the abolition of slavery, so emancipation. And so this Baptist minister, supposedly named Sam Sharp, got together a group of people and started to get the word out for a labor stoppage, for a general strike to happen after the Christmas season. Traditionally in Jamaica and throughout the British Caribbean, enslaved people were allowed certain holidays throughout, like days off of compulsory labor throughout the calendar year, one of which was a 2 or 3 day period around the Christmas time. So after that holiday was supposed to end, nobody was going to go back to work. And this happened in St. Mary's Parish in the northwest of Jamaica. And so that's just one, I think, juicy example of the unfathomability. I don't think that's a real word, but anyway, the textual record itself seems to be unable to believe that such a quote unquote civilized or sophisticated resistance to labor, like this organized, like this massive thousands and thousands of people were supposedly going to participate in a work stoppage. On a much more quotidian level, you also see records. So again, not really in the logbooks. They're mostly just charts of like tables of numbers. So to look at our other archival materials, you see enslavers like in their journals, in letters, in other archival records, you see complaining about I'm going to use a contemporary word that we probably all know in the Zoom call, weaponized incompetence. So yes, I'm supposed to go watch this boundary, but maybe I'm going to take a nap. Maybe I'm not going to be performing this compulsory labor task to the extent that the person who owns me would prefer in terms of their idea of efficiency. And so like that's kind of this other little category, maybe tucked into running away, like absconding, but it's more of like a mental absconding from, I'm sitting here at my 9-to-5 job, but maybe I'm watching Judge Judy while I'm waiting for this email to come in, to bring it into kind of a contemporary framework that some of us in this meeting, none of us does that, right? We're all completely efficient employees at all times. So I don't know. I think that that's a gorgeous question, and there's a lot there. And I gave a couple highlights, but yeah, if anybody else wants to tag into that question, I see a hand. Dr. Linder, go ahead.
If I can manage to unmute myself. Yeah, I'm really intrigued by sort of your approach. And this is one of the things that you struggle with, trying to get at the details of daily life among enslaved people. And some of my dissertation research involved enslaved indigenous people who were on plantations at the south end of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. And what you saw there was of a piece in some senses with the actions of enslaved people of African descent, both in the region and hemisphere wide. And one of the most common things that I ran into in terms of sort of the complaints of enslavers was that the people who they had working as enslaved laborers would demonstrate this spectacular incompetence. They would injure the animals they were supposed to be plowing with, or they would accidentally set fire to the cane field,
Yeah.
and those kinds of things. And so, again, one of the things that has always intrigued me about the kind of research that you're doing is the ways in which, there's this stereotype of enslaved people as being kind of passive. And I mean, there have even been arguments that they were infantilized by the experience of being enslaved. But if you kind of drill down and you look at what they're doing, they're actually displaying a remarkable ingenuity and finding a whole spectrum of ways of resisting or asserting their agency that, again, from the enslaver's point of view, reinforce the stereotypes of stupidity and passivity, but are in fact strategic, that they are in a very harsh environment, in very bad circumstances, figuring out ways of asserting themselves. And again, one of the things that we have to keep in mind about enslaved people is that what we might think of as, we'd like to think that we would react violently and resist heroically, but the risks for that are so great when you don't have any of the power, when you don't have the weapons, you don't have, again, there are those episodes of violent armed resistance, but they are few and far between compared to these, as you say, quotidian means of resistance. So, being a fugitive runs the gamut from taking off for the afternoon or hiding out in the woods until people's anger at you dies down, to actually fleeing into the interior. Jamaica, you have the maroon communities. So again, I really appreciate the stories that you're telling. Thank
you, Dr. Linder. I always appreciate your research talks too. So one follow-up point to everything Dr. Linder just said, these are points that I would agree with as well. And we also, like, we as in historians of slavery, as literary scholars, this is something I've had to tell myself my whole career is like, also don't romanticize the resistance to the point of ignoring the very real daily psychological and physical torture, and understanding how those experiences inevitably break people down on a mental and physical level. So yes, quotidian revolt, resistance, weaponized incompetence at every step, but also simultaneously, maybe paradoxical, the daily experience of extreme violence and trauma. So I just wanted to drop that in there too, even though I am like, let's talk about resistance and revolution all day. I want to read out loud 2 of the comments that I'm seeing in chat just to get those voices into the mix. And then we might be approaching last call for questions. If anyone's still there and then wants to talk about their experience of doing a time tracker journal, I'm really interested in that. So I see Mel saying, I read some archival materials from the 1500s from enslavers in Dominican Republic. They spent a lot of their time avoiding Black maroons, warning others of their concerns about them because they were particularly rebellious and trying to find ways to punish and constrain them. They lost out on a lot of sleep as well. Ha ha. Yeah, enslavers shouldn't get good night's sleep, right? Again, the caution here, right, is that's a textual record that was written by not the people it's recording, right? And so just the caution to take all of these archival materials with a little bit of skepticism. I see Katie Gray on the call. That's one of her quotes. And then Dr. Goldberg follows up, the fear of slave rebellions rules over so much of the waking and sleeping and thinking of colonizers / enslavers and the nation states they built. Yeah, heck yeah. And a contemporary example, the stop and frisk policing. Yeah, just the power structures that be and those that participate in them having this pervasive, I lost the word I wanted to use, this pervasive fear of what could confront and challenge that power.
Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. You guys, I hate to have to end it. Thank you all for participating and sharing your thoughts. And Dr. Schneider, thank you for sharing this topic with us and reminding us again, the human spirit is just not supposed to be quantified in a journal and controlled like an object. Well, so thank you again for everybody and for sharing. And I hope that you'll come back and visit us for another HU talk later today or tomorrow. There's so many wonderful topics to hear. And I hope everybody has a great day and take advantage of something during homecoming this week. There's so much going on. Have a great day, everybody.